Daily life in Britain often appears familiar to Americans from a distance, shaped by shared language, pop culture, and historical ties. Yet once observed closely, the ordinary rhythms reveal a quiet dissonance. Streets move at a different emotional volume. Conversations carry pauses that feel deliberate rather than awkward. Even routine moments, waiting for a bus, ordering food, greeting a neighbour, seem governed by unspoken rules that are rarely explained but widely understood. Americans commonly notice the stillness first, not silence but restraint. Public spaces feel composed even when crowded. Voices are softer. Reactions are muted. Laughter exists but rarely spills outward. The atmosphere suggests that emotion is present but carefully managed, kept within invisible boundaries. What might register as indifference at first slowly reveals itself as a cultural preference for emotional economy rather than absence. Everyday interactions reinforce this impression. Small talk is shorter and less performative. Enthusiasm is expressed through understatement rather than amplification. Politeness operates as a social framework rather than a personal gesture. Apologies are frequent, often issued preemptively, not as admissions of guilt, but as tools to maintain social balance. For Americans accustomed to clarity and direct emotional signaling, this can feel disorienting, as if meaning is constantly implied rather than stated. Time itself appears to behave differently. Daily schedules move with a steadier, less urgent cadence. Productivity is valued, but not loudly celebrated. Efficiency exists alongside ritual tea breaks, orderly cues, predictable routines that anchor the day. These patterns communicate stability rather than speed, signaling that life is meant to be navigated carefully, not conquered aggressively. Underlying these habits is a deep respect for personal space, both physical and emotional. Privacy is treated as a default setting. Curiosity is tempered. Personal stories emerge gradually, if at all. Americans often observe that trust is not built through openness, but through consistency and restraint. Reliability speaks louder than charisma. As these patterns accumulate, it becomes clear that British daily life is shaped less by expression and more by control. The culture prioritizes smoothness over intensity, continuity over disruption. For Americans, this contrast quietly challenges assumptions about warmth, friendliness, and authenticity, revealing that connection can exist without spectacle, and that social harmony can be maintained through what remains unsaid. This understated structure extends into workplaces, shops, and even moments of inconvenience. When problems arise, responses tend to soften rather than escalate. Discomfort is absorbed quietly. Frustration is redirected into dry humor or polite deflection. Americans often notice that conflict rarely announces itself openly. Instead, it drifts beneath the surface, managed through tone, phrasing, and timing. Disagreement exists, but it is wrapped in civility, making it harder to detect and even harder to confront directly. Language plays a central role in this system. Words are chosen carefully, often minimizing intensity. Praise is restrained. Criticism arrives indirectly, softened by qualifiers and gentle phrasing. What Americans might interpret as uncertainty frequently masks firm intention. A sentence that sounds optional can carry the weight of a decision. Meaning lies between lines, requiring attentiveness rather than immediacy. Social bonds follow similar patterns. Invitations are tentative. Commitments are flexible but sincere. Friendship develops slowly, through repetition rather than emotional disclosure. Shared experiences matter more than shared confessions. Americans observing this rhythm often sense a distance that is not unfriendly, but protective. Emotional accessibility is earned gradually, not offered freely. Public life reinforces these dynamics. Cues form naturally, without instruction. Rules are followed not out of fear, but out of collective agreement. There is comfort in predictability, pride in orderliness. Americans frequently notice how little attention is drawn to individual presence. Standing out is neither encouraged nor openly discouraged. It simply feels unnecessary. Even humor reflects this cultural calibration. Comedy leans toward irony, self-awareness, and subtle exaggeration. Jokes rarely demand reaction. Laughter is optional, not obligatory. For Americans accustomed to expressive affirmation, this restraint can feel ambiguous, as if approval is never fully confirmed. Over time, These small moments combine into a broader realization. British daily life is not built around emotional transparency, but around emotional management. Stability is preserved through moderation. Social cohesion relies on shared restraint rather than shared intensity. Americans encountering this environment often begin to recognize that cultural warmth does not always present itself loudly, and that familiarity can exist beneath layers of composure. Waiting patiently rather than reaching outward. As exposure deepens, many Americans begin to adjust their expectations rather than resist them. The initial urge to decode every pause or soften every silence slowly gives way to acceptance. Communication no longer feels incomplete, only differently balanced. Emotional signals appear subtler, but not absent. Warmth arrives through reliability, shared routines, and mutual respect for boundaries. What once felt distant begins to feel orderly. This shift often reshapes behavior. Americans find themselves lowering their conversational volume, refining their phrasing, becoming more attentive to tone than content. Assertiveness becomes calibrated. Expressiveness turns selective. There is a gradual understanding that intensity is not required to be understood, and that presence can be felt without constant affirmation. Social confidence becomes quieter, rooted in awareness rather than projection. Daily life reinforces this transformation in small, repeated ways. Waiting becomes less stressful. Interruptions feel less urgent. Moments of solitude lose their discomfort. Americans often notice that the absence of overt emotional exchange creates room for observation, reflection, and internal pacing. The environment encourages composure, inviting individuals to exist without continuous performance. Over time, this atmosphere reshapes emotional expectations. Satisfaction is found in smoothness rather than excitement. Stability becomes reassuring instead of dull. Many Americans recognize that emotional restraint does not equal emotional distance. It simply follows a different rhythm. Connection exists, but it unfolds gradually, protected by layers of courtesy and understatement. In this setting, cultural contrast becomes less about difference and more about perspective. What initially surprises Americans about daily life here ultimately reframes assumptions about openness, friendliness, and authenticity. It suggests that social harmony can be maintained without constant expression, and that meaning does not always need volume to endure. Sometimes, the most revealing aspects of a culture are found not in what is shared freely, but in what is carefully preserved.